All right. We are on page 37, the fourth lesson in our series on the Old Testament, an overview of the Old Testament. Our lesson tonight is a united kingdom divided. And I found it interesting over the course of, I don't know, the last few weeks or months, how some of our lessons kind of dovetail perfectly into the things going on in the world around us. And I tell you what, if you want to understand what it means to have a once united kingdom divided, all you have to do is to have tuned into the debates last night, and you realize how divided a country we are. I mean, it didn't even take that. If you've been paying attention, you know that the United States is really made up of two completely separate and different people groups. Have been for quite a while, and most of even our presidential elections bear this out, that they're usually 51-49 or even 50.5 to 50.1 or something. I mean, we are literally a nation that is divided between two opinions, and so Israel is not unlike the situation that the kingdom of Israel found itself in after the death of Solomon, which we're going to be looking at tonight in 1 Kings chapter 12. And it's hard to believe that the beautiful, well-organized, intelligently governed, if you will, world-renowned, I mean, it just emerged on the world scene back in 980 or so BC, this kingdom of Israel under Solomon, how it went from a rags to riches kind of story, and how quickly at the death of Solomon, it completely disintegrated. I mean, literally within months of the death of Solomon, this kingdom that he had built, and him and his father had built, and that had really been at the peak. And to this day, Israel still looks back to the time of Solomon, the reign of Solomon, as the peak of the power and the prestige of the nation and the kingdom of Israel. But with the death of Solomon, and because his son, Rehoboam, listened to some bad advice and surrounded himself with very poor advisors, the kingdom that his father Solomon had built was divided and split into a northern and a southern, into two kingdoms, northern and southern kingdom. And it goes to show that who one chooses to surround oneself with and listen to, I would submit, says more about their true beliefs and what is in their heart than perhaps even their own reputation. In other words, someone may have a reputation for being a godly or a righteous man, but if you see that the people that they hang around, the people that they bring in to give them advice or to run their different organizations or programs, are ungodly, unrighteous people or wicked people, it probably says more about who they really are than what their outward facade or persona may be. And even kind of the opposite maybe of that, the current president is a perfect example that, his reputation and his past life for sure gave Christians much concern when he came to power, 3-4 years ago when he burst on the scene. But then once, and correct me if I'm wrong, but for those listening, once he began to pick a cabinet, surround himself with people that had a reputation of being godly people, being, a vice president who was known to be a Christian man, inviting people like Franklin Graham and even our own denomination's Jensen Franklin, who the president has literally said is one of his favorite preachers. He's gone on television or whatever, and in news conferences, or been asked by the media, and he says that I'm going to go listen to Jensen Franklin preach or whatever. So those kinds of things help to give you a little bit of comfort that maybe what's going on within the man is different than the facade or the reputation that he has. And so there again, it can go both ways. Somebody with a good reputation may surround themselves with bad people. Somebody with a bad reputation may surround themselves with good people. And that can say a lot about their inward character. Be that as it may, how many knows that people can still make bad choices, regardless of who they surround themselves with? And you can, if you want to look scripturally for an example of this, think of Darius the Mede in the book of Daniel. When Darius came to power, he relied upon the prophet Daniel. He was one of his close confidants. He would even consider Daniel his friend. And yet Darius was tricked by some other poor advisors into passing a law which was meant to entrap Daniel. And he had no choice but to fulfill the letter of the law that he had decreed, and had to throw Daniel into the lion's den. But of course, you know how that story came out. But there again, even a leader who wants to do right and surrounds themselves with some good people can still make poor choices and listen to bad advice. So that's a word of warning for all of us. But appropriately enough, our lesson concerns a transition of power in Israel, and then the disaster that this transition brought when the new ruler listened and surrounded himself with advice. Actually, he had advisors on both sides, and he listened to the wrong ones. But the effects and the repercussions. So here, this was 2,900 or plus years ago, nearly 3,000 years ago. The repercussions of that decision and listening to the wrong people still carry into this day in the people of Israel. And if you look at our golden text tonight, before we get into the introduction, it says, "Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful." So avoid doing all those things and you'll be blessed. So let's get into the lesson tonight, introduction. Paragraph 1 and 2. Actually, the entirety of the introduction is really short tonight. Sister Jennifer, you want to read for us? Thank you.
When Solomon died, his son Rehoboam ascended to the throne. As with any transition of power, the coronation of Rehoboam provoked great anxiety among the people of Israel. Solomon had succeeded in expanding the power of David's throne, but it came as a great expense to the people. Generations before, the prophet Samuel had warned the people that a monarchy would result in the oppression of the people. Solomon's reign was described as grievous service and a heavy yoke. With the transition to the reign of Rehoboam, the people would hope for relief, but the temptation of power would prove too great for Rehoboam to resist. He would prove to be a toxic leader, and his reign would be a disaster for the United Kingdom he inherited from his father and grandfather.
All right. Well, Israel, you wanted a king, and you got one. You got a king. And in fact, in Solomon, they got a shrewd king. They got an ambitious king. Solomon had a vision for the people in the kingdom of Israel. He was able to do things and expand the kingdom and make alliances and increase the wealth and the prestige and the power of Israel, to see it grow and prosper. However, all of that came at the expense of the common people, just as Samuel had warned them 100 or so years ago. And actually, if you really think about it, all of this prosperity and all of the gains made in the kingdom of Israel by Solomon came at his own expense as well. His spiritual life eroded as the kingdom and his wealth and his fame increased. His walk with the Lord and his spiritual life decreased. And isn't that kind of normal? I mean, don't we see that by and large? Wouldn't that be our prediction as someone, you take any individual, and as they see their wealth, their prosperity, their fame increase, typically what happens to their spiritual life? It tends to, and that's why Jesus even said that it was easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of heaven. Is there any way to avoid that? And this may be more of a rhetorical question, because if it was an easy way to avoid it, I think it would be done all the time. But it's really hard for an individual to gain a lot of notoriety, fame, wealth, prosperity, accolades, whatever, and to maintain one's spiritual walk to the level that it was before, if it was at a high level. Very few are able to do it. So it's something that I want us to kind of keep in the back of our head as we continue in the lesson tonight. So very short introduction, and so let's go right into the number 1 on the bottom of page 37. Evil counsel divides the kingdom. And I'll read this first little paragraph here. It says, Solomon failed to maintain faithfulness to Yahweh because Solomon had divided loyalties. God would judge his faithfulness by raising up adversaries and dividing his kingdom. The greatest threat to the united kingdom of the 12 tribes would come from toxic leaders within. And read that last line again. The greatest threat to the united kingdom of the 12 tribes would come from the Egyptians, from the Babylonians, from the Assyrians. No, it would come from toxic leaders from within. You have to remember also that David's sin with Bathsheba, without which we wouldn't even have Solomon, had caused God to pronounce a judgment upon David's household and his future generations that would continue throughout the lineage of the kings of Judah, throughout all of his sons, all the way into Zedekiah, the last king of Judah before the Babylonian captivity. And it could be said, if you think about it, now who's the most famous son of David? 28 generations. I don't want to say great, 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 great grandson 28 times, but 28 generations later, who was Jesus, was of the son of David. Now think about it. God pronounced upon the house of David, because of his sin, that his children, his offspring would be at one another's throat, that there would be much conflict, there would be much strife, that the united kingdom would be divided, that they would only rule over a portion of what his intention and his goal would be. We see that going all the way to Christ. Christ inherited that judgment of God, and he took it upon, as he did with all sin, he carried that to the cross with him, the sins of David and upon David's household, that the kings of Israel would have to suffer such difficulties and bloodshed. Christ, even himself, the son of David, took that to the cross with him and put an end to that curse once and for all. And if you look at that last line, which I emphasize there, that the greatest threat to the united kingdom of the 12 tribes would come from toxic leaders within. Isn't that always the case with nations that are built upon the word of God, that nations that at one time have called upon the Lord and have been dedicated to God? You know, I'm reminded, when I read that, I was reminded immediately of one of the speeches of Abraham Lincoln, when he said that if America's end would come, he said it wouldn't come from some great transatlantic power that would step, across the oceans and come and wipe us out. He said, if America's end shall come, and I love his use of the King James language, he said, we ourselves will be the authors and the finishers of it. So if America is ever destroyed, it will be Americans that are the authors and finishers of it, that otherwise no one else could conquer us if we were united and following the leading of the Lord, but it would be ourselves. And he also quoted the Bible again in one of his famous speeches, saying that a house divided against itself cannot stand. And you look at the state of our nation and you wonder how it is standing at all, and it is certainly taking a beating. But it's because we are completely divided. There are two camps. There are 2 points of view, and they're like oil and water. They just do not mix. And so those words are prophetic, that a kingdom divided or a house divided against itself cannot stand. So let's look at section A, and this is 1 Kings chapter 12. It's verses 1 through 5. In our text, it just has verses 3 and 4, but I think that's all we need for purposes of our conversation. Let me read that. It says, 1 Kings 12, 3 and 4. And it's section A, Jeroboam negotiates for unity. So it says that they sent and called him, and Jeroboam and all the congregation of Israel came and spoke unto Rehoboam. That's where you get kind of Rehoboam and Jeroboam. It's like, God, why couldn't you have figured out how to give them two? It's hard enough to remember all these people without giving them names sound like this. So just remember, Rehoboam was the king. It was Solomon's son. And Jeroboam was one of Solomon's trusted advisors who the prophet of God prophesied would become the king of the 10 northern tribes. And so Solomon had, even before his death, knew that Jeroboam was destined to take 10 out of 12 tribes of his kingdom. So anyway, upon his death and Rehoboam is king, Israel gets together and they pick Jeroboam to go to Rehoboam and ask if their yoke could be lightened. And this is where our text is. And so, and Jeroboam and all the congregation of Israel came and spoken to Rehoboam, saying, Thy father made our yoke grievous. Now therefore make thou the grievous service of thy father and his heavy yoke which he put upon us lighter, and we will serve thee. So what we have is there's trouble in paradise, essentially. You know, that picture postcard kingdom that was King Solomon's Israel. It wasn't all it was cracked up to be on the inside, despite how it looked to the Queen of Sheba and to the different dignitaries from throughout the world that came to listen to the wisdom of Solomon and see the temple that he built in Jerusalem. So on one hand, you're almost sorry for Israel, because the people of Israel, because it's costly and painful to go from a backward, third-rate, in the eyes of the world at that time, kingdom like Israel was under Saul and certainly in the first part of David's kingdom, to go to what was practically a superpower in the world at that time. The people, the common man, they were tired, they were worn out, and they just wanted a break. Hey, we've been doing this for 40 years, building this kingdom up. And I mean, Solomon was doing things like, I was reading through last night, he was just decided, he made an alliance with Hiram, who was the king of what would be now modern day Lebanon. And in so doing, he promised him 30,000 men, soldiers, to help Hiram guard his kingdom. And it says he conscripted them. So he drafted them. So David said, hey, I need 30,000. He told his people, I need 30,000 people that are men to be soldiers to camp out in Lebanon, and I'll rotate you guys in and out, but you don't have a choice. That's what you're going to do. And then Solomon built a navy of ships, and he sent them overseas to quarry and to bring back goods and stuff. And a lot of people didn't have a choice. The soldiers came into town and said, the king wants you and you and you, and you're on your way. And so in a sense, you can understand that 40 years of this, the people were like, hey, can we have a break? And so that's why they send Jeroboam to Rehoboam and say, if you just let up a little bit, ease the yoke that your father put upon us, we will serve you gladly. Just back off. We're already, you've done, your father did so much. We don't have to be the greatest country on earth. Let's just take a break from where we were at. So, and like I said, on one hand, you kind of feel sorry for them. You understand. But on the other hand, hey, your fathers and grandfathers 100 years ago begged for a king. And when told by Samuel that this is what's going to happen, your sons and your daughters are going to be conscripted, they're going to be enslaved, they're going to be taxed, you're not going to like it. They said, we don't care. We want to be like all the other nations. We want a king. So on the other hand, it's kind of hard to feel sorry for them in a sense, because they got exactly what they were told that they were going to get. So with that said, let's look at paragraph 1 on the top of page 38. If you want to flip the page, top of page 38, paragraph 1. And Sister Jennifer, you want to read that for us tonight?
Jeroboam was one of the adversaries God raised up against Solomon. Jeroboam was one of Solomon's choice leaders, a valiant warrior and an industrious young man. Solomon recognized his leadership gifts and appointed him as supervisor of various construction projects in the lands of Ephraim and Manasseh. During Jeroboam's service, the prophet Elijah declared him to be the future king over the 10 northern tribes of Israel, leaving the 2 southern tribes to the descendants of Solomon. When Solomon heard of this, he sought to have Jeroboam executed. So Jeroboam fled to Egypt until the death of Solomon.
Think about that. When it was a prophet of God, so it wasn't just anyone, it was a man of God, and Solomon knew him to be a prophet. It's a prophet we don't talk about a lot, Ahijah. And Solomon heard Ahijah declare that Jeroboam was going to take the 10 northern tribes. And remember, Jeroboam's minding his own business. Jeroboam was not seeking this. He was not rebelling. He was a faithful and loyal servant of Solomon. Had been promoting him because of his service to him. And when the prophet of God declares that Jeroboam is going to inherit the 10 northern tribes, Solomon, this man of God, this king of kings, if you will, what does he do? He sought to have Jeroboam executed. And Jeroboam then flees to Egypt until Solomon is dead in fear of his life. Isn't this reminiscent, if you think about it, of what Herod? Now, when we say King Herod, we don't think of a magnificent king as far as a man that was, a man of God, a man of, from the Davidic line and who had the start that Solomon had and was blessed with the wisdom that Solomon had. We think of Herod as a tyrant. But there again, isn't this very reminiscent of what did Herod do upon hearing that there was another king by the wise men, essentially by the prophets? Basically, they were just saying what the wise men were saying, what the prophets had foretold, that there is one that is destined to be king. What does Herod do? He sets out to try to kill all of the children in Bethlehem. And then how does Jesus and his family, how do they flee from the execution that Herod is trying to bestow upon them? They flee to Egypt, and they have to live there and wait there until Herod dies. And that's kind of exactly what is playing out here, except it is not Herod, but it is Solomon who is the tyrant. And it was through Ahijah who was the one who promoted or declared that Jeroboam would be king. And Solomon is literally trying to stop the will and the word of God from taking place. And you talk about if ever there was a time to issue that old statement, how the mighty have fallen, that Solomon himself, the one blessed by God, is now trying to commit murder to stop the will and the word of God from going forth. How did we get from a man who 40 years earlier, his prayer was, I just want wisdom, Lord, to be a good leader. I don't need wealth. I don't need fame. I just want to be a good leader, and I desire wisdom, to a man who says, I will commit murder to stop the will of God and the word of God from going forth. And this was, mind you, this was the man who is declared to be the wisest man ever, the wisest man alive. What it tells me, and this could be a mini quote of the night if you want, is that wisdom seldom overcomes human sinful nature. I don't care how wise you are. Wisdom in and of itself, the wisdom of man, you can be the smartest person ever lived, but it seldom will ever overcome our own sinful human nature. Don't ever count on I don't care how wise, how smart you are, how close to God you think you are. Don't ever count on your being able to make the right decision when you put yourself in compromising circumstances. There are very few Josephs in the world who have the ability to run from evil when presented with that in that situation, and too many, and we all know of them, and some of us in this room have been in situations before where we said or did something or committed some act that we knew better. Oh, we were wise. We know, if somebody counseled us, I know better than to do that. And yet we find ourselves doing the very things that we were wise enough to know not to, and yet we did them anyway. And how many ministries have fallen? How many ministers do we know that were some of the wisest people, spent so much time in the Word of God and taught about things, and then you find out that they wound up doing something that they had just taught against. They knew better. Don't ever count on your own wisdom and ability to overcome your own sinful nature in and of itself. Solomon had wisdom to rule the people, but not to rule himself. If we see anything in his life, he did have wisdom to rule and to create, from scratch practically, one of the greatest kingdoms this world has ever seen, and yet he could not rule his own self and control his own life. How many knows that the hardest one to ever try to rule is your own mind and your own self? It's easier always to see the speck in someone's eye than to see the log in your own eye, as Jesus said. How was Solomon unable to rule himself? What are some of the examples that we could point to that Solomon, in his wisdom, still made poor choices when it came to his own personal life? What are some of the things that stand out?
Selection of wives and eventually worshiping their gods.
Right, selection of wives. So, in the wisdom of man, taking on the wives from these other countries was a great political move. It was savvy. It wound up, you can't fight and have a war with a country when the king of that country's daughter is your wife. And so he took this to the nth degree, 500 times. And if that wasn't enough, then he had 700 mistresses on the side. That doesn't seem very wise, does it? Yet it began in wisdom. There was a shrewd political move, and that's one. I mean, that's probably the most glaring example. But of course, allowing these wives, then, and he could have very easily said, "Hey, this is my country. I'm the king. We serve one God." And it's not like in that day and age that the wives had a lot of say in the matter. He could have laid down the law, but what did he say? He let them bring their idols and their gods, and he even would go so far as to build little temples and rooms where they could worship their gods to try to keep them happy. I guess because he didn't want them writing letters to daddy back in Egypt or where else saying that, I'm miserable here. He wanted to try to keep the peace, but in so doing, it came at a personal cost. Jennifer, do you have a comment?
I agree, but I feel like there's so many examples of things that he could have, should have, would have done differently that made it, like, just for one thing, maybe David his enemies rather than his alliance, where he chose to keep peace with other countries, he chose not to with his own people.
Right. He couldn't see. He was so busy building the kingdom that he didn't realize that he was destroying the morale and the spirit of the people while he was doing so. And like I said, this is the wisest man. I mean, without
Speak well for mankind.
yeah, does it? If that's the best of us. Now, granted, it's the wisest man outside of Jesus, but as far as man's wisdom can take you. But Solomon was still subject to sinful human nature. Something else that affected him, and it brings up an interesting point. I want to turn to 1 Kings chapter 4. So if our lesson's in 1 Kings 12, so just got to backtrack a little bit. 1 Kings 4, verses 24 and 25. And it says, for he had dominion over all the region on this side of the river from Tipsah unto Azah, over all the kings on this side of the river, and he had peace on all sides round about him. It's talking about Solomon, the extent of his kingdom. It says he had peace on all sides around about him. And Judah and Israel dwelt safely, every man under his vine and under his fig tree, from Dan, that's the far north, even to Beersheba, that's the furthest south city, all the days of Solomon. And then if you flip over to chapter 25 and verse 4, it says again, but now the Lord my God hath given me, Solomon speaking, rest on every side, so that there is neither adversary nor evil occurrent. So what this says is that for the entirety of Solomon's reign as king, now what are most kings known for? Is leading the armies, going to battle. What was David known for? Exactly that. Why was it that David couldn't build the temple? As God said, because you have shed so much blood, because you're a warrior, and I'm going to give, you've won the battles, but now your son is going to inherit a kingdom of peace, and he will be the one to build the temple. But Solomon fought no battles. And let's put that kind of we're talking about the decline of Solomon spiritually. And he had it easy. And it was, make no mistake, it was a blessing from God that Solomon's kingdom, those 40 years, was a kingdom and a reign in which Israel saw no war. They fought no battles. And yet often, things that are meant to bless us, sometimes and many times, wind up being a stumbling block and a curse to us. And in this instance, peace, how many knows peace is a blessing? Not having a war, incredible blessing. Wealth, fame, all of these things that were God blessed. So, and God, when Solomon said, all I want is wisdom, what was it that God said? Because you asked just for wisdom, which is such a noble thing, I'm going to bless you with wealth and fame and all these other things you could have but didn't ask for. I'm going to give them to you anyway. So how many knows that this peace, this wealth, and this fame all was part and parcel that played into Solomon's downfall? If that being the case, and this is something, here again, this is where we can really take this lesson about somebody that lived 3,000 years ago and examine our own selves. Why then did God so bless him if it was going to wind up causing his own downfall and being a curse to him? Think about that. Why did God bless him? Was it God that turned the blessing into a cursing? No.
God's goodness is not dictated by our future badness.
Mm-hmm.
Like free roll agents, God blesses us.
Right.
We make choices from that point on. God's not going to not bless his people, especially according to his word, just because of what they might do somewhere down the road. That's the grace of God is.
Right.
He actually blesses us.
If God's people were not blessed, how would the world view God? Right? And yet, should we cry out, though, God, do not bless us? Do not allow us to be a testimony to the world because we can't handle blessing? Good, Daniel, you're going to...
Solomon, he was kind of like Adam in a way, because here God gave Adam everything, blessed him with the garden, with the earth, with everything, and gave him freedom of choice.
Right.
He blessed Solomon, gave him,
right.
all this stuff, and he also had the freedom to choose, and he chose what he
Right.
chose.
Ultimately, it is man's sinful nature that turns God's blessings into cursings, isn't it? Almost without fail. And in thinking about this, I was trying to think of a good example. And here's a perfect example that starts right at the beginning of creation, throughout the Old Testament, New Testament, and even to today in a sense. Look at the Sabbath day. God made the Sabbath day. Was it a blessing to man? You think in the ancient world, in most other nations, in most other kingdoms, there was no such thing as a day off. You worked, from daylight to dark, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And if you didn't, because a lot of people were slaves, but even those who weren't slaves, they had to survive. But here, God created a day off, a day free from labor. That was his admonition. I rested. I want my people to have a day of rest. And here was the blessing of God. He's like, my people will never starve to death because they took it the day off that I gave them. So even when they're in the wilderness, he wants them to take the Sabbath off. What does he do with the manna? He gives them a double portion on Friday so that they can have enough so that they don't even, and how hard is it to just go out and pick up the manna off the ground? He's like, you don't even have to do that. I want you to spend time with your family. I want you to not have to worry about work and, going out and pruning the orchard or weeding the fields. You take that day off and you dwell with, contemplate my goodness, my mercy, and you spend time with your family, and it is a day of rest. Is that a blessing? So what happens by the time Jesus comes around? What has happened to that day of rest and blessing? It becomes a day of worry and a day of stress. Why? Because man got involved and added all of these rules and regulations to it that people were scared to death that they were going to commit some, if you take 27 steps, you're okay, but the 28th step, you're in violation of the law. God's law? No. And what Jesus said, how many of you, if your animal, your donkey, fell into the ditch on the Sabbath day, you would try to get him out? But somebody, they were criticizing Jesus for healing somebody who was sick on the Sabbath. And he's like, you guys, you totally don't understand that the Sabbath day was supposed to be a blessing to you, that you were free from having to wake up and know I have to go out and work. Like, it doesn't mean you couldn't walk around, that you couldn't help somebody that was in need. That, in fact, isn't that the spirit of the Sabbath, is to take time from your normal labors to focus on someone else and to do, and so that's how man, in our sinful state, we take things that God has meant to be a blessing. So in Solomon's case, he gave him a kingdom devoid of war, but that caused him to have so much free time on his hands that he spent it instead of spending it in service to the Lord, he spent it doing things that he ought not to do. And he turned it in to a curse. So should God just never bless us? Is that the moral of the story? Should God just, Lord, we can't handle blessing, just don't bless us. I do believe that there's a lot of times that God does withhold blessings from people out of love, because he knows that, why are some people work so hard and they never seem to get ahead in life or something? It's perhaps because if they got that triple paycheck, triple amount of money or something, that next thing you know, they're too busy going to the lake and buying a boat and going on trips that they don't have time to go to church or to work for God or do things like that. I certainly think that is the case. But oftentimes, even through all that, God does continue to bless us. Because if nothing else, even when we mess up the blessing, it teaches us something. It teaches, it can be an object lesson for us. It can be an object lesson for someone else. Something else before we, I'm spending a lot of time on this one paragraph, but there's a lot of things that we could unpack here. On 1 Kings chapter 9, so this is a few chapters ahead of where we just read and a few chapters back from our lesson. 1 Kings chapter 9 and verse 25. I want to read something, and then I just kind of think about it while I talk, kind of build up. But I want you to pick up if there's some other thing about this verse here that gives us a clue about how Solomon went from the wisest man who just wanted God's wisdom to rule his people to a man that was willing to commit murder to try to thwart God's word and his will. So verse 25 of 1 Kings chapter 9, it says, "And 3 times in a year did Solomon offer burnt offerings and peace offerings upon the altar which he built unto the Lord, and he burnt incense upon the altar that was before the Lord, and so he finished the house." And this is talking about the temple. So as it's speaking about how Solomon built the temple to God, this, the story, the greatest, most beautiful building the world had ever seen to that point, one of the wonders of the world. And it says, verse 25, 3 times a year he did offer burnt offerings and peace offerings upon the altar which he built unto the Lord, and he burnt incense upon that altar, and so he finished the house. Now there is a clue here that I want us to pick up on, but let me say this first. After we get our petition from the Lord, so after we get the thing that we've been seeking, how many knows Solomon, because it was ingrained with from his father David. Solomon had spent his whole life hearing about this as a child, seeing the plans and the drawings for this temple. And Solomon, when he became king, he set out to build this marvelous temple to fulfill his father's wishes. He entreated God and asked God for wisdom to be able to do it. After we have a dream, a goal, a desire, a prayer request that we make petition to God, and he grants it, typically, what do we do after that? After we get what we've been praying for. We've been praying hard every day. What's that? Hopefully we say thank you. But longer term, what do we, from that point on, something, say you've been praying for something for 10 years and God finally gets, like you get up every day and the first thing in the morning, last thing at night, you're obsessed on it. What's that? The next, okay. Okay. Let's hope. But what do we typically continue in the same fervency of prayer and seeking God after he gives us what we want that we had? How many when in March and April were praying hours a day not to get coronavirus and not to lose your job and not to all this, to now that, well, we've made it 6-7 months without too much problem. Maybe I don't need to pray as much. Don't need to pray as hard after we get seemingly, we didn't die, like you might have been worried about back along, a while back. Do we typically, what is human nature? Do we keep the same level of, we stop praying, don't we? We relax. We take things for granted now, right? Well, you think about this verse that I just read. And I think most people that have read it, and honestly, before this lesson, I read it and I didn't think anything of it. But when you read this lesson, read this verse 25 of 1 Kings 9, it talks about, what does it talk about? Solomon offering sacrifices to the Lord, okay? How many times a year was Israel required by the law of God to go up to the temple and offer sacrifice? How many times a year was Israel required by God, every man, to go up to the temple? Regardless of where you lived, whatever. There was three, well, I'm just about gave it away. There was 3 feasts. Yeah, it was like Passover, Pentecost, and Feast of Tabernacles. But there was 3. So what was the bare minimum?
You got nervous, Jeff.
That's the right answer. No, it's okay. No, it was 3. It was 3 times. If you read the law, every man of Israel was required to go to the temple 3 times a year. Now read verse 25, 1 Kings. Here's Solomon. How has God blessed him? In every possible way imaginable. God has given him the wisdom that he sought. He gave him exactly what he asked for. And then because it so pleased God, he gave them all the wealth, all the wisdom. People are coming from all over the world just to see him. I mean, he's the first rock star, mega celebrity, a celebrity pastor, yeah, if you will. He in the world. I mean, people are coming just to see him, see what he's done. He has been blessed and his wealth. And now something else I want you to consider is, here's roughly, and very roughly, the city of Jerusalem set on kind of a hilltop like that. And you had the original city of David encompass this part. And then after Solomon became king, this was actually like a little valley here. He filled this in. It was called the Milo. He fills this in. And then up here on this platform, he builds the temple. And his palace is right here. Now, the distance between these two, probably from here to the Trucker's Minute Mark, the distance between the temple and Solomon's palace. How many times a year did Solomon go to the temple to sacrifice to the Lord? The wealthiest man on the planet, the wisest man on the planet. How many times did he walk 150 yards and go to the temple to offer sacrifice to God? The minimum amount required. Sister Alice.
My Bible says that the burning incense before the Lord along with them, and so he fulfilled the temple's obligations. So he did only what he was obligated to do, nothing extra.
Yeah,
He's the original CEO. This Easter only.
you read my notes there. He did the exact least amount possible. Even for, now think about it, somebody that lived 100 miles, a Jew that lived in Dan, 100 miles away, had to go 3 times a year. He lived 150 yards away, and he went 3 times a year. The man who had been blessed above every man on earth. He was too busy to go to church because God's blessed me so much. I have so many, you don't understand. I have so many people wanting to see me. I have so much advice I have to give. I have so much building projects that I have to oversee. I don't have time to go to church. And as I had this in my notes, he was literally, I'll go on Easter, I'll go on Christmas. I'll go when it's kind of have to required that it would be unsightly if I don't go. I'll go then, but I won't go. In this, you have sown the seeds of his backsliding and his immorality. When we purpose after God has blessed us, that we will now do the least amount that we can. And you want to think about something else? This wasn't church. I mean, we put it in that context. This wasn't a building where God's people got together and fellowshipped and whatever, and I don't like to go because sister so-and-so bugs me or whatever. This housed the literal presence of God. God himself was right here in Solomon's own backyard. And he could only find time to be feet away from the literal presence of God. How incredible was this presence? Read the story of when they dedicated the temple and read when the presence of God entered the temple, what transpired. And how powerful the presence and the Shekinah glory of God was in this place. It was literally in his own backyard, mere yards away. He only went 3 times a year. I think I've driven that point home. But what does that say? He's the wisest man who ever lived. What does it say to us about our own lack, oftentimes, of gratefulness? He should have went every morning when he got up and offered a sacrifice just to say, Lord, thank you. I mean, look at what you've done. Look at how you bless me. There was no reason he couldn't have done it. He lived right there. So anyway, okay, let's look at Rehoboam rejects wise counsel, middle of page 38. Where are we at on time? Man, we're running out of time. That's good. We're on pace here to go about an hour. Oh yeah, yeah. There we go. There we go. So Rehoboam rejects wise counsel, 1 Kings chapter 12, verses 6 through 11. And I'll read the text here, and it's actually in our commentary. It just lists verse 7 through 10, I believe. It says, and they spake unto him, saying, and this is the children of Israel and Jeroboam, I believe, speaking to Rehoboam again. If thou wilt be a servant unto, this is the counsel, this is the counselors speaking. That's what you get when you don't read the whole passage. The counselors are speaking and advising Rehoboam, the king. It says, if thou wilt be a servant unto this people this day, and wilt serve them, and answer them, and speak good words to them, then they will be thy servants forever. Verse 8. But he forsook the counsel of the old men. It was the older men that had counseled him to basically listen to what the people's complaints are and grant their wish, lighten their burden, and they'll serve you forever if you be a servant to them. But it says that he forsook the counsel of the old men, which they had given him, and consulted with the young men, now listen to this line, that were grown up with him. So now he's going to turn to his own peers, his buddies, the guys he grew up with, his own personal Memphis mafia, for those of you who get that reference, which stood before him. In verse 9, it says, and he spake unto them, what counsel give ye that we may answer this people who have spoken to me, saying, make the yoke which thy father put upon us lighter. Verse 10, and the young men that were grown up with him spake unto him, saying, thus shalt thou speak unto this people that spake unto thee, saying, thy father made our yoke heavy, but make thou it lighter unto us. Thus shalt thou say to them, my little finger shall be thicker than my father's loins. In other words, you think that my dad was tough. You ain't seen nothing to how tough and how big a burden and yoke I will put upon you. Sister Jennifer, can you read the first paragraph for us?
Rehoboam sought the advice of his father's elders. The elders advised, if thou wilt be a servant unto this people this day, and wilt serve them, and answer them, and speak good words to them, then they will be thy servants forever. The elders understood that proper authority and power is exercised in service to the people and elicits loyalty from the people. Since the days of Samuel, the purpose of the king was to shepherd the people of God. The king was responsible to protect their well-being. Jeroboam's position in behalf of the people was a reasonable request. One of the first symptoms of a toxic leader is the failure to listen. Proverbs 1:5 declares, a wise man will hear and increase in learning, and a man of understanding will acquire wise counsel. Even so, Rehoboam failed to hear the sensible request of the people and the wise counsel of the elders. Instead, he consulted with the young men that were grown up with him.
Okay. Now, so he had two groups of counselors, apparently. The old men, who were probably carried over from his father's counsel, that had been around the block, seen a few things, and his buddies that came to power when he came to power, that got into the inner sanctum of the palace now because their high school buddy was now the king, if you will. Now, let me just say this. It is just because someone is old does not mean that they are right, that they have good counsel, that they're wise. Some of the stupidest things I have ever heard in my life have come from people that were 70, 80 years old, who you would think, oh, these are senior citizens that have seen a lot and they should have a lot of wisdom and good counsel. It's not always the case. But in this case, it was the case that the elders, the leaders, did give him good counsel. And the young men, as it says, who grew up with him, his buddies, wanted him to be a tyrant, wanted him, when the kingdoms had come, the tribes had come to him and asked him to lighten the burden, his buddies wanted him to tell them that not only was he not going to lighten it, but he was going to increase. You ain't seen work like you've seen, under me, like I'm going to give you. Make it harder, crack the whip. Now, what do you think motivated them? What motivated the younger group of his buddies to give him this advice, as opposed to, they were standing there, they heard the advice of the elders as well, but they had the polar opposite advice for him. What do you think was a motivation for them? Why?
To be on his side and him to take them along the ride that he took them.
Okay, well, they kind of already were there. They were already in the palace, right? If they had given him the other advice, that the elders had given, they would have still been in the palace. It just would have meant the rest of the nation of Israel wouldn't have to work as hard. Could it be the fact that they had been waiting for their chance? They knew Rehoboam was going to be king, and so they've been, riding his coattails for years, waiting for this chance to come to power. And if he relaxes, say, the amount of taxes coming in, if he relaxes the growing, how many of these young men had visions of being overseeing this, new conquest or this new construction project and all this? This is my chance to earn a fortune, to take a part of the tax money. Because obviously when the people were taxed, it went into the palace and it was dispensed to the inner court, the king and his entourage, right? So were they looking out for the best interest of the people of Israel? And remember, this would include some of their own kin and their family. But they wanted a piece of the pie. They wanted power. And if he relaxed power, if he let up some of their own opportunity to gain this power that they'd been waiting for, and they had been salivating for all these years, would likely dry up. So why did Rehoboam listen to them then? So he had two choices. They're very clear and distinct choices. Why did he choose to listen to his buddies, the younger men, than the older generation? What do you think? So we kind of have a clue what motivated his friends. They wanted more power, more prestige. They didn't want him to relax it now that they were in power. What do you think motivated him to listen to them, though? Isn't that just probably to sum it up perfectly? These were his buddies. He grew up with them. They kidded each other. They did the things that, he wanted to be accepted by his peers. He didn't. These old guys, they're going to be dead in a few years. I don't have to worry about them. They're not going anywhere. But my buddies that are my age, I'm going to have to listen to them and be with them for the rest of my reign. And do I want to start my reign by upsetting, making them unhappy? And so it was literally, and the cool, wanting to please the cool kids, and all of that entailed. He wanted to be liked by his peers that he'd have to spend the rest of his life with. And so their plan also promised more. Hey, if you do this, you'll have more power, you'll have more money, you'll have more wealth. And of course, appealing to greed, typically, historically, is also something that humans have a weakness in when you're told you can have more than what you have now. Does it make a difference who you surround yourself with? For any that have a peer group, any that have an entourage, if you will, or a close circle of friends, you should always ask yourself, why are they there? Why, if people want to hang around you, be around you, go where you go, and whatnot, that's awesome. That can be a blessing. How many knows sometimes blessings can be a curse as well? You should always ask yourself, why? What is their motivation? What are they getting from me that could be an ulterior motive to simply wanting to be your friend? With the case of, you think that these guys didn't know that Rehoboam, when he was 10 years old, 12 years old, 15, whatever. Now, he didn't come to be king until he's like 40. So these guys have been hanging around him his whole life. Why? They know he's going to be king, and they want a piece of the action. That's why they were hanging around. That's why they were his friends. And we see this. They didn't care about the people of Israel. Daniel, did you have a question?
Not really a question, but more of a comment.
Sure.
Like the younger generation that you're referring to, they also might have been in that same mindset that he was, to only go the minimum
Right.
amount of time to go and give sacrifice. Where the older generation, not hanging around the older generation and listening to them, that would go probably more often.
Right.
That would also be the lifestyle, if you will, that he would live, to where he would do the least instead of the more, what the older generation.
Okay. Good thought there. Good thought. Bottom of page 38 on that last paragraph, it says, even so, Rehoboam failed to hear the sensible request of the people and the wise counsel of the elders. Now, let me ask, was it a failure to hear, a failure to listen, or was it a failure to care, ultimately? Often, I would submit people, you and I as individuals, or if we want to say government at all levels, companies, corporations, I mean, they have suggestion boxes, they have town hall meetings, all of this. Do you think that by and large, they don't hear? They don't know what's going on? They don't know the issues at hand and how it affects others? Or is it that they just ultimately don't care? Mm-hmm. Do you think, I mean, let's put it in our own state. Do you think Gavin Newsom hasn't heard all the hardships being brought on by the shutdowns? You think he doesn't know? You think he hasn't heard about the dangers of not cleaning up and clearing out our forests year after year? You think he hasn't heard that? You think he hasn't listened to that for years? But is it that he hasn't heard? Or is it that he doesn't care? Because are his actions like Rehoboam because he didn't know or didn't care because he has an ulterior agenda and motive? And so one plays like I'm listening to you and I'm considering, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what I hear. I have my own agenda. I have my own will, and I'm going to do that, and I really don't care how it affects someone else. Let's finish off on page 39 under letter C, the second paragraph. Let me read this real quick, and this is a good place to end this conversation talking about the United Kingdom divided. So it says, we too often attribute strife and division. This is the middle of page 39. We too often attribute strife and division to the work of the devil. But the biblical text clearly says Rehoboam's disastrous leadership was the judgment of Yahweh. For it was a turn of events from the Lord, verse 15, chapter 12 says. God allows humans to choose between good and evil. But when humans choose evil, God will allow the toxins of evil to intoxicate the people, destroy the land, and judge the nation. The toxic seeds planted by Solomon bore their full fruit in the reign of his son. Rehoboam's obstinance almost led to civil war among the people of God. Only the intervention of God saved the people. Now, it's an interesting thought in regards to the current state of America, is it the devil to blame? Is the devil the one who is responsible for the toxicity of our society today at all levels, whether it's local, county, state, and certainly the country as a whole, in our federal government and the like? Is the devil to blame for all of our problems, all of the corruption of our government, all the hatred and the animosity? Or is it simply the judgment of God on a people who didn't care and didn't invest time to look into policies and to look into leaders and what they stand for and to pray for wisdom in the choices and the selections we make? And the church, God's people, sat back for decades and simply allowed things to go on and happen without really caring. The result of our apathy, as we look at it today, is a completely divided country. As it was in Israel's day, so too is it in our day. And God always, think about this historically, God always allows division prior to judgment. Why? Because if God is going to judge, you have to pick a side. And isn't that what we see taking place in America today? Judgment is coming upon America. It's not the devil. I mean, the devil is at work, as always, but it has been the people who have been blessed. It has been the church for decades that didn't take enough time to even go vote, didn't take enough time to look into the background of people that were running for office and just rubber stamped it or didn't vote at all. And whatever happens, happens. It doesn't matter, whatever. Our apathy. And because of that, God is bringing judgment upon us. And the prelude to judgment is division, because you have to pick a side. Are you on the ark? Are you not on the ark? Are you, think about the Civil War. Are you one side? Are you blue or are you gray? I mean, you have to make a choice when God's judgment comes. And we're living, as we stand here in this day and age, just prior to the start of the Great Tribulation. Once again, God is not only dividing America into two camps, but he is dividing this world into two camps. And I'm reminded of the words of Joshua, how long halt ye between two opinions? And the words of Elijah, who is coming again very soon and may utter the same words to Israel that he did on Mount Carmel. Choose this day who you will serve. And so that would be how I would wrap this lesson tonight up on the kingdom of Israel that was once glorious and once united, and the steps that led to its division. We see them playing out in our own country today. And we had better get on our knees and pray and ask God to help us, because only he can. There's no one that has the answers to how to fix the situations that we're in. But we do serve a God who can, and he can bring a revival to this country yet again. And I believe that's his desire. And before judgment comes, he does give an opportunity for revival. And I think we're about to enter in to that great revival. Amen. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for tuning in at home, and we will see you Sunday morning. And if not, we'll see you here next week, next Wednesday night, as we are in lesson number 5 of our series on the Old Testament, Wisdom from God, talking about the Psalms and the Proverbs. All right. Thank you. Good night.